True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
In the early morning hours of July 22nd, 1987, a motorist came across a black Cadillac that had crashed into a telephone pole on a secluded road in Santa Clarita, California. So when police were called to the scene, they found two unresponsive young women inside the car. The driver, who was later identified as 45-year-old Claire Peernock, had severe head trauma and was pronounced dead at the scene. Claire's 18-year-old daughter, Natasha, who was in the passenger seat, also suffered severe head trauma, but she, miraculously, was still alive. Join us for A Dangerous Mind, Robert Peernock. From the outside looking in, the Peernock family's life seemed okay, but during their investigation into what they strongly suspected was a staged crash, detectives learned the truth about Claire and Robert's marriage. When Claire filed for a divorce that was still pending, she sought custody of Natasha and her younger sister. Claire had also asked the court for an order of protection from Robert, citing multiple instances of threats and abuse. So Claire had known that Robert could be a dangerous man, but not even she could have predicted his twisted plot to eliminate the people that he was supposed to actually love and protect. Family members, right?
Right. You think they'd be okay?
You would think, but no, not with this guy.
No, he's a piece of work.
This is a sick dude, yeah. So, throw me a beer. Let's go.
Got you a beer. We're going to drink a little Blind Pig today.
Nice.
It's an American IPA, 6.5% alcohol, brewed by Russian River Brewing Company, one of my favorite brewers from California. This beer is gold color, 1-inch white head, very pretty lacing, aroma of citrus and pine, a really nice nose, smells great, has a grapefruit and orange taste, a little bit of pine that comes in later and lingers on your palate. It's crisp and juicy. These guys can brew beer.
Crisp and juicy, yep, sounds good. So, why don't we open beer? Yay. And pour some.
Okay. I just happen to have a few of these.
Nice, because I'm thirsty.
Yeah, well, it's 100 degrees outside.
Yeah. All right, come on down here to the quiet end and let me tell you a little story.
Tell me a story.
It was just after 5 p.m. on July 21st when Natasha Peernock's best friend Patty pulled her car up in front of Natasha's house and parked with the engine running. So her father's car was out front and Patty offered to go inside with Natasha. Natasha, who her friends called Tasha, got out of the car and popped her head back into the open window. She had chores to do and she would just stay out of her father's path, no worries.
So there's some tension in this house? I mean, she wants to avoid her father.
Yep, the girls know it.
Doesn't sound like a particularly nice place to go home to.
No, I don't think she liked to go there. He wasn't even actually living there, though. He hadn't been around the house for a while. Because although her parents weren't officially divorced yet, he had a girlfriend and he was just normally sleeping at her house. And Patty, being close friends with Natasha, knew that Robert Peernock was not a nice man. He yelled at Tasha and had even hit her before, more than once. But Tasha assured her friend that she'd be fine, and she waved and Patty drove off. So the front door was locked, and that was unusual. Tasha took a moment to find her key. The house was usually unlocked when anyone was home, and now both of her father's cars were in the driveway. Although Tasha had been hoping to get her chores done before her mother came home from work, it was surprising, and it was disappointing, too, that she wasn't going to be alone. Her father, she knew, was somewhere inside the house. So she walked inside and shut the door quietly behind her. It had been a long time since she had come home to find him there. For years now, if something required him to be at the house, he always made sure to be gone before her mother got home. And that suited Tasha just fine, because she didn't want to listen to the fighting. So she paused inside the door and listened. The house was very quiet, and it seemed empty. But then Robert Peernock opened the sliding glass door from the backyard to come inside, and their eyes did meet through the glass. Tasha ignored him and headed down the hallway to her bedroom. She tried not to hurry, afraid that if she rushed, it might provoke him. A few seconds later, she was in her room, feeling safer, hoping for the sound of the front door closing and for him to drive away in his car. So for the past month or two, he'd been coming around much more, almost every day really, picking up personal items, papers, and tools. Whenever she did come home while he was there, he would harass her too, about her friends, her schooling, her clothes, or one of his favorite things was to harass her about the utilities in the house. She was using too much electricity.
Oh, so you should turn the air conditioners off.
Something, yeah.
Don't cook on the stove.
Yeah. Well, Tasha stayed in her room, killing time, just kind of waiting for him to leave, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, she changed into different shoes to mow the lawn, but still there was no sound of him leaving. So when she ran out of ways to kill time, she decided to just go out there and face up to it. And she didn't see him when she walked back down the hallway and into the kitchen, so decided maybe he was busy somewhere else and she could just make herself something quick to eat. Because remember, she was going to go out with Patty and a couple of friends that night.
Yeah. And she's going to mow the lawn first before her mom got home.
Yeah, she was going to do her chores. Now, she hadn't started eating yet when Robert walked into the kitchen from the family room. At first, everything seemed normal enough. He stood in the doorway and watched her. Tasha tried to focus on making her food, trying to send the message that there wasn't any point in talking to her. But he just kept standing in the doorway. Then he asked her about her mother. When was she due home? Was she working late? Tasha just played dumb, but she did worry that she was ignoring her father a little too much, and that might make him more angry. So his voice did turn angry, and he began pacing back and forth in the doorway, and now he was yelling at her about the high electric bill.
See, I knew he
Of course, it's his favorite. So Natasha just couldn't resist talking back to him. She's a teenager after all. So she wasn't really all that surprised when he moved toward her and grabbed her with both hands around her throat.
So you're telling me that this is kind of normal behavior for this family?
I think at the beginning, yeah. But then it just got to a point where it was more than it had been before.
Yeah, I mean, this is a real physical confrontation.
Oh, yeah, totally. Very physically abusive man. So she couldn't breathe, and her hands were grabbing at his wrists to try and get them off her throat. But he pushed her backwards with his weight on her neck. She struggled, but she didn't have the physical strength to defend herself. Her feet were barely on the ground as she fell backward, and Robert landed on top of her on the floor of the family room. So up until then, Tasha hadn't been that afraid. You know, unfortunately, she'd dealt with a lot of his violent outbursts in the past, and she'd usually gotten through it without having to go to the hospital. So the poor girl, that's her way of measuring.
Yeah, and it's been for some time.
Yes.
It's not like this started a month before.
No. Ever since she had once gotten between her parents during a big fight back when she was 13, after ending up with a broken arm and 3 weeks of traction, Tasha had learned how to deal with her father's rage. At least she thought so. You just had to keep quiet and wait for your chance to escape. But this time it did feel different. She held back her sobs, keeping still until Robert stopped and let her go. He stayed on top of her, staring down into her face. Tasha glared at him as he pulled his hands off her throat. So Robert looked down at Tasha before he stood, and he looked like he was making some kind of a decision, which was scary. He said, "I have something that will make you feel better." Then he walked away, leaving her sitting confused on the floor while he went out the front door. So Tasha really had to fight to keep her self-control. She was feeling panicky. The fear was really growing inside of her now.
I can imagine. It sounded like he was trying to strangle her.
Yeah, well, he pretty much was, right? Hands around the throat?
Yeah.
Yeah, and he's probably going to come back. So whatever her father had to make her feel better, she knew it would be something she didn't want. Yeah. So she knew this was a saying of his that meant something bad was going to happen. So it was clear that she'd made a mistake in staying in the house with him. and she didn't want to repeat the mistake by waiting around to see what he would do next. But she couldn't go out the front door without running into him. She could head for the back door, but the backyard had a steep hill and a wire fence blocking an open field. So both routes at the side of the house would only lead from the back to the front, and she'd end up where he was. So of course, if she could break the family taboo she lived with all of her life about showing their troubles to the neighbors, then she could have run screaming into the street and hoped that some neighbor would help her before Robert could hunt her down and hurt her even worse.
Yeah, that's not a good plan.
Well, I just think it's sad that she didn't feel comfortable doing that, right?
Yeah.
After years of living in the area, the male neighbors mostly avoided Robert Peernock, and the female neighbors rarely even came to the house, especially if they saw his car in the driveway. But she heard a car door slam outside the front entrance, and before she could hope that he might drive off, she felt his footsteps vibrate on the floor behind her as he returned to the family room. So everything happened quickly. Before she could turn around, she felt him grab her wrists from behind, and panic gave her some strength against his grip while she fought. Though she did everything she could to fight off the much bigger man standing over her, pinning her arms back, within seconds Tasha felt some steel bands snap tightly around her wrists. She was able to twist around just far enough to see that they were handcuffs. But then she felt her head forced back and realized the handcuffs weren't the only things he'd brought in the house. Blue canvas moved in front of her eyes, and she felt her father's hands on top of her head. There was some rough fabric pulled over her face, and his hands were forcing it all the way down to her neck. So everything went dark, and then she tried to throw herself onto her side and kind of rub the hood off her head by rubbing her face on the carpet.
Yeah.
But her father pulled her up into a seated position, and she felt something like a noose digging into her throat. So this is terrifying. It was so tight it was burning the skin, and resistance was pretty much impossible. But once she gave up her fight, the tightness around her neck loosened just a little bit so she could breathe. So now she's handcuffed, hooded, and pinned to the floor. Can you imagine the terror?
No, it's a horrible feeling.
Yeah, because she wasn't really that afraid of him because she thought he was violent, but that he'd like hit her or something and then stop. But now he seems like he's really almost got a plan. So
yeah. She said, "Are you going to kill me?"
Yeah,
and
she
he
did.
said, "Yes." That's going to
terrifying.
Invoke even more terror in me.
Yeah. So she really thought her life was going to end. The hood's mouth hole wasn't much bigger than a dime, and then she felt a plastic tube press against her lap as he pushed it through the hood. Tasha then started to cry, but as soon as her lips opened, the tube was shoved down into her mouth. So she really had to concentrate to fight back her gag reflex, fearing that if she vomited, then she would aspirate. She'd choke to death.
Yeah, well, you're hooded up.
Yeah.
Got a rope or something around your throat. This isn't looking good for her.
No, I mean, you could actually drown in your own vomit in the hood. I mean, it's horrible to think of.
You could.
So she didn't know how it was being held in place, but she couldn't spit the tube out, and she wasn't able to form any words. Then she tasted alcohol burning and pouring from the tube into her mouth. The taste was harsh. She'd never had hard alcohol before. She coughed and tried to spit it out and started gagging. But he was completely remorseless, had no empathy, no sympathy. "Swallow it, Natasha," he said. "This is the best way. Just swallow it." So he pushed her down onto her back and held the tube in place. The alcohol ran down the tube and into her mouth, slowly enough for her to swallow. Then, while he continued to force the alcohol into her, he decided to go to the next stage of his plan, and he dragged her to her feet, forcing her to stagger blindly down the hallway. When he turned her to the right, Tasha knew that they had entered her mother's room. So her fingers could feel her mother's bedspread, and her father then pumped a little more alcohol down the tube. But this time it didn't last very long. He leaned over and turned on the radio, and an FM station was preset to play classical music. Robert left it tuned to that station. He got up, but he still didn't leave her. A moment later, Tasha heard her mother's closet door open. Now this closet wasn't only her mother's, because even though Robert had pretty much moved out years ago, he still had guns in that closet, a shotgun and a revolver. She knew he also kept ammunition in there.
Well, that's swell.
Yeah, and he didn't keep her guessing about what it was that he had been trying to find. She heard the clicking of a revolver. So her father was then holding the barrel of the gun at her head, and she sat quietly and offered no resistance, hoping he would just go away. But he pushed her onto her side, knocking the tube out of her mouth. He pulled her feet up onto the mattress and tied her feet together with rope. She couldn't see the rope, but she could feel the bristles against the skin on her ankles. A moment later, she felt her father roll her over onto her stomach and yank her feet behind her, all the way up to her wrists. Then he tied the rope that was binding her ankles to the chain between the handcuffs. So I think they call this hog tying.
She's kind of hog-tied.
Yes.
That's not very comfortable.
Well, no. And it's scary.
Yes, it is.
So as Tasha lay on the bed, her father gave her pills now and more alcohol. Then Patty was at the house. Remember her friend who dropped her off? So she was there to pick her up for their evening out. And Patty must have gotten tired of waiting for her to call, so she just decided to come over. And Tasha heard her father back out of the bedroom and close the door. So now even if Tasha screamed and Patty ran for help, how long would that take? And in the meantime, what would Robert do to her? So she felt like she couldn't scream. Maybe Patty would just figure out that something was wrong and she would call somebody to help her. Tasha tried to remember if Patty knew where her mother Claire worked. A warning call to her mother at work might bring a call to the neighbors, or maybe even a call to the police. At least that's what she was hoping. But Patty had called the house many times and kept getting the answering machine. Then she went to the house, and she knocked on the door for several minutes and didn't get an answer. Both of Mr. Peernock's cars were still parked there, just as they had been when Patty dropped off Tasha that afternoon. So it was getting dark now, and she could see light from the TV screen coming through the curtain on the front window. Claire's car wasn't there, but Natasha was pretty reliable, especially when it came to going out and having fun together. If something had come up, she would have called. Patty went around to Tasha's bedroom window and knocked on it in case her friend had fallen asleep. "Hey, Tosh, are you in there?" Patty was calling up at the window, but Patty heard no answer. She didn't hear anything. And there was something even stranger. She noticed that the curtains were closed and the TV was on inside, and nobody was answering the door, so it really did seem weird.
Definitely.
Patty went back to the front, and Mr. Peernock's Cadillac was parked there the whole time. But it was usually covered up and stored when it was there. Now it was parked there, like he'd driven it. His regular car, the one he drove most of the time, was hardly ever there at night, and this wasn't even his home anymore, really. So at that point she noticed that the grass hadn't been touched, even though Tasha had made it clear that one of her chores was to cut the lawn before she went out that night. So Patty did have a bad feeling, but she was young, she had no idea what to do, so she just gave up and left. Everything went quiet inside the house after that, and it took another 15 or 20 minutes for Robert to come back into the room after Patty left. But Natasha didn't ask what had happened. With the tube again wedged into her mouth, he held her down on her back and poured another few swallows of alcohol into her. So Tasha couldn't see, but she heard the dogs barking in the backyard, and then she heard some loud thumps. So now she knew that her mom had come home, and her father had attacked her. The next thing she knew, Robert picked her up and carried her out to the garage and put her in the Cadillac. The door was closed and everything became silent for a moment. She was almost in a sitting position, slumped to the right against the passenger side door, with her feet bound in front of her. So she pushed her feet outward slightly, felt the back of the front seat, and realized that she was in the back seat of her father's Cadillac. Her cuffed hands could reach down and feel the leather seat. The Cadillac was roomy even in the back, and it even had room for two adults to slump sideways, hooded and bound hand and foot. And they could be packed in so that the tops of their heads wouldn't be visible to any passing police cars. So Tasha could hear breathing coming from someone lying on the back seat next to her. With her hands still cuffed in front of her, She was just able to reach over and touch the person, but there was no response. Once her fingers brushed the hair, though, she knew that this woman was her mother. I mean, she'd spent her whole life with her.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the driver's door opened and someone got in. And of course, Tasha knew this was her father. But much later, she would be forced to admit that she hadn't been able to see the driver and she hadn't heard the driver's voice. Her senses told her that her best chance for survival was to stay passive. So she felt the car begin to move as the driver drove the two women away. She guessed that they traveled for 15 or 20 minutes, but by then she'd endured hours of isolation, plus she was kind of drunk and drugged. But Tasha would remember hearing trucks passing by before the car stopped and the rear passenger door opened. She felt her mom being lifted out and heard her being quickly placed back inside the car, this time in the driver's seat. Moments later, she felt herself being lifted up and carried to the front passenger seat. Then some tinkering mechanical sounds were coming from underneath the car. They'd stopped and then started again. So a train passed by. Like the nearby traffic, it sounded close. And wherever the Cadillac was parked, there was enough distance that the two people in the trucks and the two people on the train were likely speeding by without even knowing that two women were trapped in the big black car at the side of the road, and that they were in desperate need of help. They certainly didn't know that. So it's like you're there and you know that people are nearby that could help you, but there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, a helpless feeling. But I'm sure that picked the isolated enough spot.
Oh, sure. This was meticulously planned, very planned out.
Yeah, you're going to tell us about that.
We'll go into that because the car was really rigged. So Tasha listened to the metallic sounds under the Cadillac, and she still had a little physical control left, despite her cuffed hands, her bound ankles, and her blindness inside that canvas hood. She reached out over her mother's unconscious body. Slowly, she ran trembling fingers down the steering column until at last her fingertips brushed the ignition. When she stretched her cuffed hands out toward the key, she realized the sounds under the car had stopped. So she thought that maybe she'd be able to run him over. That's why she was reaching for the ignition. But by the time she got her hands on it, it was too late.
I imagine it would be rather difficult to run him over with her hands handcuffed in front of her and her feet bound.
Well, sure, but she's desperate.
And she's in a sack, so she can't see. But yeah, you're right. She's desperate. Try to think of anything that she can to get her out of this predicament she's in.
So sometime before 4 a.m. on July 22nd, 1987, a motorist named John Dozier pulled over to the side of a dark road. He tried to focus on a mass of twisted wreckage off the right-hand shoulder, and it seemed to be a single car wreck, and no one was moving at the scene. So he looked closer. A wisp of smoke was rising from under an old Cadillac near the side of the road. The rear of the car was still on the gravel shoulder, but the front straddled the remains of a wooden telephone pole. So it looked like the heavy '71 Cadillac had rammed the pole with such force that it had splintered and collapsed the pole. The front of the car had come to rest on top of the remains of the pole as it lay on the ground. Dozier knew that on an isolated strip of road like this one, it could be hours before anyone else came by. So he hurried over, opened the driver's door of the Cadillac, and found a petite young woman lying inside. There were no signs of life, and he tried to pull her free. But, she was jammed under the dashboard beneath the steering wheel, so he couldn't get her out. Then, on the floor beside her, he noticed there was a female passenger. He could hear her moaning. So on the floor beside her, Dozier could hear a female passenger making noises. The door on the passenger side was jammed in place, and there was nothing he could do to free the second victim either. But then he remembered that thin wisp of smoke rising from under the car. He realized an explosion could happen at any second, so Dozier left to find a phone and call for help. So it was 4:25 a.m. when paramedic Clyde Peepoff was sleeping during a 24-hour shift at the fire station in the North Hollywood area of Los Angeles. He received a radio dispatch from the main dispatch center in downtown LA. The operator directed him to proceed to San Fernando Road in the town of Sun Valley, so he called for his partner, paramedic number 2, Todd Karb, as well as a trainee, and within moments the three were rushing to the scene. So just about 4 minutes had passed since their call came in, and Clyde saw the first body before he and his crew had even exited the ambulance. So there was a woman laying on the floor under the steering wheel, with her back against the driver's seat and her head slumped against the door frame. Her knees were jammed up under the dashboard, with her right arm on the floor and her left arm protruding from the open driver's side door onto the ground. So visibility inside the car was a real problem. The dome light was not on, even though the driver's side door was open. So in addition to evidence of massive blood loss, the woman had brain matter exposed just above her eyes. So after his first check of the woman hanging out the doorway, he noticed the second body on the floor of the passenger side. And the second passenger, also a female, wasn't moving either. But Clyde noticed that the smell of gas from the wreck was unusually strong. Looking around the interior of the car, he saw puddles of gas on the floorboard, and concerned that they could be dealing with an active fuel leak, the paramedics rushed. In that first moment, he had noticed that blood was also spattered across the inside of the windshield and around the gear shift. But there was, strangely, no damage to the windshield itself or the steering column. In fact, except for all that blood, the interior of the car did not appear damaged at all. And he couldn't tell if the spattered blood was from one or both of the women. But when Clyde noticed a thin leather strap, several feet long and knotted at both ends, lying across his patient's face, he immediately began moving carefully, trying to disturb the scene as little as possible.
So does that sound like a garrote?
No, I think it was more of something to set up the car to start on fire, which I'm going to go into details about how that was set up. So while Clyde was busy with his examination of the woman on the driver's side, other details of the scene looked out of place. There was a partially empty bottle of whiskey lying on the driver's side floor, but the odor inside the car was more like gas than alcohol. The driver's clothing was soap, but the odor on the clothing was gasoline, again, not alcohol. The driver's head injuries were so severe, her face so bloodied, that he couldn't even guess at her age. Clyde couldn't imagine what she might have been hit with inside the car that would tear her up so badly. It didn't make sense. But with nothing else to go on, he noted that the driver was small and trim and estimated her age to be around 30, while he went ahead and checked her for vital signs. But at 4:35 a.m., Clyde pronounced his patient dead at the scene, and this was Claire. On the passenger side, the other paramedics called out to Clyde that the second victim had signs of life. So as soon as they began to check her, leaning in the window to determine her condition, they confirmed that there was a very strong odor of gas inside that car. It was pooled on the floor around the second victim, soaking her clothes too. So John Dozier had returned to the scene and stood in the background watching, and at that moment he called out a warning to the driver of a street sweeper from a nearby gravel company who had pulled his rig over to protect the scene from traffic. So Dozier directed the driver to the source of smoke under the car. When Clyde hurried around to help with removing the survivor, the street sweeper's driver warned Clyde of the fire danger. Clyde got on his knees and looked under the car. A piece of rope that he would later describe as looking like a wick hung from the undercarriage below the gas tank area. So the rope had been partially burned and the end of the rope still smoldered. The smoldering rope made it urgent that they get the surviving young woman out and away from the car. The deceased driver would have to remain in the car for now. So Clyde put out the call for additional help, then rushed back to help his teammates remove the survivor. Given the severity of her injuries, they moved her out as quickly as they could, but like the woman on the driver's side, the passenger had suffered massive head and face trauma. It took extra seconds to handle her with care as they got her strapped to a backboard with her arms and legs fixed in place and a cervical collar stabilizing her neck. Such precautions are standard under the circumstances, but careful handling of the surviving female became more urgent when they found what appeared to be brain matter on her clothing. The paramedics didn't know yet if the brain matter was hers, so they rushed the surviving passenger away on the gurney to begin first aid behind their ambulance, which had been parked away from any gasoline from the wrecked car. So with an apparently severe skull fracture and the resulting possibility of coma, the traumatic shock of moving her.
First, they don't get her out of the car, and the gasoline ignites.
Well, yes, we know that. That's
one
obvious.
thing.
Don't need to go to med school for that one.
But with the head trauma, and she's unconscious, so you just don't have any idea how severe the trauma was. And she could be fragile enough that moving her, if she had a spinal cord injury or brain injury, just moving her without being careful how you're positioning her head and neck, that could kill her.
Yeah, and paralyze her, I imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So while Clyde directed the treatment and the gentle questions, he noticed an engine company arriving in response to his call. So firefighters used a 2.5-gallon water gun to soak down the smoldering rope under the car. Then they pulled a hip line over to spray off the accumulated gas under the car, reducing the danger of an explosion. So amid the flash of emergency light, the typical noise of an accident scene was beginning to drone on in the darkness. Idling engines rumbled under the crackles of dispatch radios. So Todd and Paul, the paramedics, continued with the surviving passenger, while Clyde asked the firefighters to leave the deceased woman in place after the fire was under control. So he knew that police investigators would not want anything disturbed more than had already been necessary. So if you have to disturb it to save someone, sure, but anything beyond that, they don't want to touch it.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds kind of callous, but the driver is already dead.
Yeah.
So there basically isn't any hurry to get her out.
No. I mean, you have to make these decisions in an emergency for sure.
Right.
So Natasha was a little bit conscious. She could see forms moving and she could hear sounds. But the messages coming in were getting lost somewhere and she couldn't communicate them effectively. Arson investigators responded between 5 and 5:30 that morning. They saw a fire engine, a patrol car, and an ambulance already there. Plus, now there were a handful of onlookers. The hood and trunk of the car were open. The fire captain told them that when he had arrived on the scene, he'd found both closed, but that his men had had to open the hood to check for sparking. The firefighters had also taken the trunk key from the ignition to open the trunk and make the same check there.
Yeah, well, they certainly had to make sure there was nobody in the trunk. They have 2 injured people in the front of the car.
True.
What if there's another body in the back, in the trunk?
Yeah, injured or dead, you don't know.
Right.
Either way, they certainly have to check.
They certainly do.
So in those first moments, they learned that a surviving passenger had been removed from the car and was being given treatment in the ambulance, but that she was in no condition to tell them anything. The heavy car really was built like a tank, a 71 Cadillac.
A fortress.
So despite a collision severe enough to knock down a telephone pole, most of the damage to the car was in the area of the right front fender. Other than having one front wheel collapse, the car was almost drivable. Inside the passenger compartment, there was no observable damage to the interior other than a small ding in an air conditioning vent and a thin crack in the lower right portion of the windshield. They saw the deceased woman on the driver's floor of the car, and there was a large amount of blood on the dashboard and on the floor. So the paramedic and the fire inspector suspected that some of the residue was brain matter. So like the paramedics, the fire investigators believed that the dead woman was in bad shape for being in such a well-preserved automobile. It just didn't match up.
No, I mean, the car was relatively intact, and injuries that the deceased person had were way beyond what should have happened.
Exactly. So when they opened the trunk, they saw a gas can, some scraps of paper, some rags, and a wooden stick. And, strangely, it appeared they had all been burned recently. The rags even were still warm to the touch. So the site under the vehicle was consistent with a crime scene. The rope wick near the gas tank was wrapped around some type of metal bar. The bar had a sharpened edge and was pointed toward the gas tank, with the tip of the point about half an inch from the fuel. The other end of the bar was secured to the car's undercarriage by one single screw. So even though everything under the car was quite dirty, the single screw holding the pointed bar was shiny and clean like a new screw. The location of the partially burned rope added to suspicions of attempted arson. But with a dead woman in the front seat and a severely injured female pulled from the wreckage, the scene left no doubt that this was arson and that the purpose of the arson was murder.
Yeah, this turns out to be a fairly sophisticated, not a way to get the car to explode.
Yeah, well, you know that Robert Peernock had a lot of knowledge about that sort of thing.
Yeah, he was an engineering type, right?
Yeah, yep, and he had worked in pyrotechnics before.
Huh.
So somebody had gone to a lot of trouble to turn this car into like a self-destructing death trap. And despite the strong, persistent odor, there were no ruptures in the gas tank. So it was possible to speculate that if the big Cadillac had not been stopped by the telephone pole, and if the car's huge V8 engine had gone on building momentum until the car hit the retaining wall at the road's dead end, the metal bar could have rammed and punctured the gas tank. With the rope, it was like a wick, still burning and attached to the metal bar that was secured under the fuel tank, there really could have been an explosion with an extremely hot fire. So with the amount of gasoline pooled inside the car's interior, the county coroner would have to identify the deceased just through dental records.
Yeah, like I said, that was a fairly sophisticated device that the perpetrator had done. And certainly, I mean, even if you didn't have Peernock's knowledge of pyrotechnics and so on, I mean, he's already going to be a suspect.
Oh yeah, well he's got the motive, right?
Yeah.
So poor Natasha, she wasn't able to tell the first responders that the other person in the car was her mother, Claire. But when they checked the car for IDs, they found two purses, and one had a driver's license in the name of Claire Peernock. So it was after midnight on July 23rd, more than 20 hours after the crash was discovered, when Natasha's consciousness was slowly returning. So she was fighting to open her swollen eyelids, but the puffy flesh around her eyes barely let in any light. They had removed her contact lenses, leaving a haze, so she could really only see that she was lying in a hospital bed and couldn't see any further. Later, while she fought back the remnants of anesthesia, she became aware of a nurse at her bedside adjusting IV drips and monitoring her vital signs. When the nurse saw Natasha's eyes flutter open, she smiled down at her. "How does your head feel? Do you think you could answer a few questions?" Well, Natasha was still confused, but she was able to say that her mother had been in the car with her. And Tasha would later describe her state of mind in the hospital as she came to. There were distant images, sounds, and voices, memories of a revolver's chamber spinning next to her ear over and over and over, crashing sounds of a violent struggle coming from the other side of a bedroom wall, the cold feel of steel handcuffs, the panic as straps tightened around her throat, and ropes being pulled tight around her ankles. Also, along with all this, there was her father's voice, assuring her that she was going to be killed. So how awful is that?
How'd you like to wake up to that?
It's bad. So she began to fear where her father was at that moment. If he was nearby, was he trying to get into the hospital? Would she even know him if he appeared in the room? Without her contact lenses, she couldn't see as far as the door frame. So she wouldn't even know if the person coming in was wearing a hospital uniform. Natasha had no idea how much longer she might survive, but enough of her memory had returned so that she knew there was somebody out there who had a strong motivation to kill her before she could remember all of the details. So she was really struggling to remember as much as she could.
So Natasha's going to remember what her father did to her and how he had tried to kill her and succeeded in killing her mother.
Yeah, but before we get to that, let's get a little background on Claire and Robert. We really haven't given a background on their lives before this.
No, and I'd very much like to know.
Yeah.
Particularly his.
Yeah. Well, Claire married Robert in April of 1967, and she was a French Canadian who had moved to the U.S. from Quebec. As a 24-year-old new bride living in Hollywood, California, Claire described her life to friends as being full, and she saw a bright future filled with happiness. A former family friend who was a guest at the pool party where Claire and Robert first met described Claire as having been swept off her feet by Robert. So nobody was surprised when Claire and Robert became husband and wife. Claire confided to friends that Robert gave her a more intense level of attention than anything she had ever known. So she was captivated by his treatment of her and the pleasure he seemed to take in just being with her. So it sounds a little bit like love bombing.
Yes, it does.
So they had their first child about 2 years after the wedding in June of '69, and they agreed to name her Natasha. Both parents doted on her, but Robert really made her his little princess. Claire filled photo albums with pictures of Robert holding Natasha and playing games. She was unquestionably a daddy's little girl. So for the first 10 years of the marriage, Robert moved up the corporate ladder as a technician with expertise in computers and with a talent for fixing complex problems in circuitry. He also worked as a pyrotechnics engineer. So he eventually rose to the rank of vice president at Network Electronics Corporation, where his specialty was in testing explosive devices. Robert's technical skills were exceptional, and he did have a strong ability to guide currents through countless connections.
So he certainly would have the knowledge and the ability to make a device like there was in the car.
Absolutely, yeah. It's really right up his alley, don't you think?
Yes, sounds like.
So in the early years of their marriage, Claire admired his ability to identify a problem at home or at work and to focus on it relentlessly until a solution was found. So that made her feel assured.
Yeah, well, she's fairly newly married and has this wonderful husband who's so smart and has a skill set that would enable him to be always employed.
Yeah, he had the skill set, and she knew he'd always be able to have a good job and be a provider. But the beginning of Robert as a whistleblower began a while back, well before the night of his wife's murder and his daughter's near-death beating. Because up to that point, he had led a really enviable life. During the rise of his career, he had shown qualities that society expected from successful men. He was strongly self-motivated, he took additional courses of study throughout his career, and he developed a special level of technical expertise. So whatever fears Peernock had of professional or personal defeat, he kept hidden. He did show a love for conflict once he decided that there was a reason to target someone or something. So he kind of enjoyed that. But the dark path that eventually led him to committing crimes would be a long one. It began many years before, in the 1980s. That's when Robert came before the U.S. District Court to sue the state of California and a bunch of his superiors at California's Department of Water Resources. So the complaint read like a textbook on standard conflict situations between whistleblowers and the corruption they expose. The main plot of his struggle began with his employment as an inspector for the DWR, and that was when he was about 35. And he would swear that shortly after being hired, he was told by a superior that instead of doing his job as a watchdog against malfeasance by contractors and suppliers, his true responsibility was to sign off on inferior work done by the contractors, whether the work met with specifications or not. So he told of being warned that if he didn't play along, not only would he be forced out of his job at the DWR, but that the DWR had mafia ties, and he would be endangering himself if he opposed any cover-ups. So after repeated threats were lodged against him, he finally went to the man who had hired him at DWR and complained that if he did as he was told, equipment would not meet minimum safety requirements and it would take years to correct all of the problems. And this would cost California millions of dollars. Worse, he said, the safety problems could create fatal hazards for DWR workers.
Oh, sure.
And I think this was legitimate. I think he really was trying to help at that point.
At the beginning.
Yeah.
Yes.
He said his superior admitted that all of this was common practice and a known problem, but that if he was strong enough to try and force contractors to meet specifications, his boss would see to it that he received the full backing of the DWR. But that didn't happen. Instead of that, Peernock was told by other employees that he was going to be harassed out of his job because he'd made enemies.
Yeah, that's not a good thing.
No. So if that's true, he was in a bad spot. He was stripped of his inspector's authority, and the contractors were told that they were free to ignore him. So this must have really made him mad.
And this is an ongoing problem for Robert at work.
Yeah, it went on for years. So from the late 70s all the way through to the morning of his wife's murder in 1987, Robert was always involved in a series of lawsuits in state and federal courts in his ongoing attempt to get the corrupt officials off of the state payroll. So he presented bits and pieces of evidence to support his claims, but he never had enough to set off the federal investigation that he wanted. But it is the arrest report for the only crime Peernock was ever convicted of prior to the destruction of his family that really lays out what happened. It all took place after he turned 42, so that was about 7 years after his whistleblower struggles had begun. The arrest report tells how he was at the job site discussing a company calisthenics program with one of the men whom he supervised when Peernock lost his temper and attacked this man. So apparently he grabbed the man around the neck, and when the man tried to run away, Peernock hit him with a fist to the side of his head and face. And this attack resulted in his conviction. But he was only convicted on a misdemeanor count of battery. And of course he had a different story for this.
Sure.
Where it wasn't his fault.
Well, be that as it may, he's the one who tried to choke the guy and hit him.
Well, yes, but
So-
he was saying he didn't start it, I guess.
No? Okay.
So, by the time Claire and Robert's second daughter was born in 1977, he was spending less time with his family, so the marriage was not going so well. The distance between he and Claire was growing, and his fixation on his causes grew because, in some rare instances, a few were starting to get some results. Robert began to feel like he was finally proving his point in a way the state and eventually the feds would not be able to ignore. So he really stepped up his efforts then. Natasha remembers that it was at this time in the late 70s and early 80s when her role as Daddy's little girl was lost. Because she was growing up, she was developing a will of her own. Natasha found herself replaced in his affections by her new little sister, who was still a young toddler to be completely controlled by Robert whenever he spent time with her. Claire was spending most of her time at home alone or in violent arguments with Robert when he was at home. Natasha says by then, because of Robert's repeated outbursts against Claire and because of the violence Natasha witnessed him repeatedly inflicting on her mother, she had decided that her father was an evil man. Claire worried that no settlement would ever be enough as Robert's campaign against the state dragged on and on. And she even confided to friends that she was afraid he had found his true love, and it certainly wasn't her or the children. But this battle at the same time did wear on his health. He had trouble trying to sleep. He became very irritable. Robert started coming home angrier, constantly indignant that no one appreciated his efforts, not even his wife, whom he wanted at his side in this struggle. So his nerves seemed frazzled after a long day battling corrupt officials. And Claire showed some family friends her bruises to show just how dangerous it was to be around him when his tensions were getting high.
This abuse has been going on for a long time.
Years. But it was in the recent years that the problems between Claire and Robert grew. Claire had no more patience for Robert's campaign against the state, and Robert felt betrayed by her refusal to support his efforts. So hostility infected their communication and their relationship. all the way down to conversations about the most mundane things in their daily lives. And by 1983, the anger inside the marriage was really getting bad. Claire intervened as often as she could to keep Robert from taking his rage out on Natasha, and in May 1983, Claire and Robert were having one of their arguments in the kitchen when the confrontation turned violent. Natasha would tell how she saw Robert grab Claire and begin to push her around. Natasha jumped in front of her mother and demanded that Robert leave her alone. And the next thing she knew, this is when Robert threw her against the kitchen wall. He drove her to the ER, and on the way there, he made sure that Natasha understood that she was to tell the doctors she had slipped and fallen while playing in the house.
Yes, let's get our stories straight.
Right. And she spent the next 21 days in traction for a shattered collarbone. Claire did come to visit her and told her daughter that she agreed with Robert. Natasha should lie to the hospital staff. So that's not really the best thing, but she was just so afraid. She was afraid of what Robert might do once he was alone with them again if they admitted the truth.
Yeah, well, I get the impression that the violence was kind of accelerating.
Yeah, I think it really was.
So I can see where she might want to try to minimize the repercussions from telling the truth.
Exactly. Well, Natasha really didn't have the strength to speak out against her father alone. After all, she was a child. But she gave a different story to everyone who asked at the hospital. And that was her way of maybe trying to get someone to notice.
Yeah.
You know, she hoped maybe if I tell a different story to each person, they'll notice that my stories don't add up and they'll put something together.
That's a good thought. Probably one that wouldn't be successful.
No, it wasn't. I mean, either nobody put it together or no one came forward with their suspicions. So the violence in the Peernock home was a secret, and it would stay that way for another 4 years. So the Peernock marriage would never recover from this, and by the next year, Robert had a girlfriend, and he was sleeping at her place most nights, even though he did continue to keep most of his belongings at the family house. And that was fine for Claire and Natasha. Claire was glad to have the place to herself, and Natasha finally felt safe at home for the first time in years. Claire found a secretarial job and began thinking about a real life on her own. The traditional marriage had ended, and the checks were coming in every month on his real estate holdings, even though Robert by this time was no longer working a job. But settlements on some of his many lawsuits had left him quite a bit of money. He had enough money to save over $250,000 in various bank accounts. And this is in the 80s, so that's a fortune.
That's a good amount of money.
Really? So in early November of 86, despite her patience and her years of not being able to break away from Robert, Claire's time as an enabler of her husband's violence was coming to an end. Claire began looking for a divorce lawyer, and she chose the small law office that was located nearby in a single-story mall. So it may have been a referral from a friend, or maybe she just wanted to discuss her issues with another woman, and this was the first female lawyer she saw. So she was about to confront a very forceful man, divide their property, and claim her half of the money that he had amassed. So it certainly wasn't going to be easy.
No, it would not be.
No. So November 13th, a few days after the initial consultation, Claire returned some financial papers to attorney Victoria Doom's office for use in determining property settlements. How do you like that name, Victoria Doom? I love it.
I kind of smiled to myself when I saw her name, thinking it's very apropos.
Yeah, it sounds really strong, doesn't it?
Yes.
So Victoria was going to figure this out, and Claire paid her a retainer. So the divorce was finally going to happen. 2 days later, on November 15th, Claire took out a State Farm life insurance policy on herself for $10,000 that was payable to her daughter, Natasha. And nobody really knows why she did that. She did call her longtime friend Louise, who had been at the pool party where Claire and Robert had met 20 years before, and told her she was finally getting a divorce. She confessed to her that she was afraid that Robert might try to kill her, but she said that she was resolved to make the change. Still, despite Claire's best intentions, her actions put her on a real collision course toward her own death. really kind of helped to set things in action.
Yeah, galvanized Robert.
It did.
He needed to do something.
No fault of her own, but yes, definitely. And this also changed things for Victoria Doom. Accident investigator Mark Warshaw had tried to speak to Natasha before they loaded her gurney into the ambulance. But remember, she'd been too badly injured to be of much help. All she'd been able to do was mumble a few words in response to his question about the identity of the other passenger. He hadn't told Natasha that the other passenger had died. She wouldn't learn about that until days later in the hospital. But Warshaw had been an accident investigator for over 8 years, and he knew he would have to hope that the paramedics could stabilize her and give the doctors a chance to save her. Then hours later, just before noon, he stopped by the hospital to check on her, and he learned that she was still in the ICU, but that she was more responsive. He got permission to talk to her for a few minutes. She was fading in and out, giving erratic statements. The doctors were still assessing her head wounds and working to stabilize her condition before putting her under anesthesia to operate. Warshaw moved in close to her bedside and quietly introduced himself, but she seemed barely aware of his presence. So this was, he realized, the only person in the world who might ever be able to tell him the truth about what had happened. So a very important witness.
Yeah, the only other person who could tell what had happened is the person who did it.
And he's not going to do that. So he began asking her questions. He worked slowly and gently, but Tasha faded in and out of consciousness. Gradually, she did manage to say 1 or 2 meaningful words through her broken teeth until a rough story did come out in bits and pieces. She gave the last name of who she thought was her companion. That was her friend Patty. And she remembered that they had left Patty's house on the day the crimes began, around 7:30 or 8 p.m., and they'd gone to Natasha's house. She said that they then had left Natasha's about 10:30 and went to meet some guys. So she murmured that this was the last thing she could remember before waking up at the hospital. And she seemed to be giving her best memory of the night before, but she clearly wasn't much help, and she wasn't really accurate. She just remembered being with her friend and really hadn't remembered anything about her father or mother at that point.
So clearly she wasn't able to give a good story or a coherent story.
No, not yet, but she will be.
Yeah.
So Mark Wausau didn't know who Patty was, but he knew that the Los Angeles coroner's office had already identified the dead woman as Natasha's mother, Claire. And at that point, the x-rays came back from the lab, and they showed multiple skull fractures. Natasha was going to have face surgery right away, too. So about 5 hours into the investigation, the police received a call from Robert Peernock. So he called them up. He said that he had heard from a neighbor that Claire and Natasha had been involved in a traffic accident. So he's really acting like, oh my gosh, I just heard this.
Yeah, although he didn't seem that upset or shocked.
No, not at all. He told them that he didn't live at Claire's house anymore, but that he did come around frequently. He said that he was at the house painting some shelves, and Claire and Natasha were there drinking. He said they kept drinking until they were sloppy drunk, but he stayed out of it because he didn't want to get involved. At some point, though, the house was quiet, and he saw that they had taken his Cadillac and were racing around in his car, waving a bottle of whiskey out the window. So can you just picture a mother-daughter? These are just a normal mother-daughter. It's really hard to believe.
Yeah, but his story can fit what the actual occurrence was.
Yeah, it supported a drunk driving accident. But when you look at the evidence, it really wasn't a drunk driving accident.
Yeah, no, once we get to look at the Cadillac,
yeah,
that story is going to vanish.
Yes, yeah. But Robert agreed to come to the police station for further questioning, so that made the police satisfied for a time. But in the meantime, the Cadillac had been taken to the police lot where it was processed and examined by arson and accident investigators. So they checked every part of the car, and based on burn patterns, they were able to establish that there had been 2 separate fires intentionally set just before the car crashed. Beneath the car, they could see gasoline burns going down under the gas tank. and the burn pattern led the investigators to find more unusual rigging under the car. They found the rope tied to the trailer hitch that ran under the car to the rear axle, and that rope was saturated in gas and had also been set on fire. So, it's not a subtle thing here.
Oh, no.
No.
A pretty ingenious thing.
Kind of, yeah. If it wasn't so evil, you might think so, right?
Right.
Then they found that metal bar under the car that had been tied to the axle by the cotton rope. So this odd-looking metal bar had been screwed next to the gas tank and sharpened to a point about half an inch from the gas tank. It looked like the metal bar had been set up to puncture the tank upon impact in the car crash. But the Cadillac had not hit the telephone pole hard enough to do that. If it had penetrated the tank, the car likely would have had quite an explosion.
Well, I bet it would have.
Yeah.
Because of Robert's training, he would be able to figure out how to rig it so it would definitely explode.
Yeah, and he put time and thought into this. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing at all.
Oh, no.
So the police know that Claire had been murdered, no question, and her murder had been planned. So within 12 hours of the wreck being discovered, investigators were putting together a list of suspects. Of course, Robert Peernock was the number one suspect, and the police were awaiting his arrival at the police station. But you know what? You're going to be shocked, but he never showed up.
He didn't arrive.
Nope.
Amazing.
I know. So the morning after the crash, detectives still had not heard from him, and they tried again to talk to Natasha in the hospital, but she still wasn't making a lot of sense. Her head injuries were so severe that her memories were mixed up. Detectives were looking for Robert, who was not at the Peernock house, but they were able to track down his girlfriend, Sonia Siegel. Still, he wasn't at Sonia's house. When the police talked to her, she couldn't believe that he could have been involved in the crash. She denied having any information about where he was, and she repeated the same story he had given about him painting at the house and how Claire and Natasha had taken off drunk in his Cadillac. The police told her they had to speak to Robert. They didn't give her all of the details, but they did tell her that Robert needed to call the police as soon as possible. And then they continued looking for him. They were trying to bring him in calmly and interview him, but it was becoming obvious that he was not wanting to cooperate. So after days of not hearing from him and not being able to find him, the police received a strange letter. So this is the letter that was written by Robert Peernock and delivered through his attorney.
Very good.
And in this letter, he claimed not to be involved, and he explained that the reason he couldn't come in was that he was a whistleblower against the state of California, and he was afraid for his life. So he basically said he thought the police may have been involved in a conspiracy to silence him. He assured them that he had damaged corrupt people in the government, and if he was to come into the station, he was afraid he'd never get out again. So he claimed the car crash must have been part of a deadly conspiracy against him. So they'd done this to the wife and daughter to make it look like he did it, to get him in prison, and then get him out of the way. So it's pretty elaborate, this whole story.
It sounds like he's even contradicting himself, though. Because he originally told him that his wife and daughter were in the car drunk.
Yes, true.
And took off. And now he's saying, well, it was caused part of a conspiracy against him.
Yeah, how would the people that were setting him up know that his wife and daughter would be in the car? Or that it would crash? So, really far-fetched. Detectives still had to look into his claims, but they weren't very hopeful about the validity of that. They did look into public records and could verify that he had exposed some corruption, but there was no evidence of any conspiracy. Then a detective went back to talk to Natasha in the hospital because she was waking up and she was more lucid now. She told police how her father had attacked her and forced alcohol and drugs down her throat. After her dad had been forcing the alcohol into her with a plastic tube, she remembered her mom coming home. She heard her father wrestling her to the ground and attacking her. Hours went by, and Natasha could hear her mother in the room with her, still alive, unconscious but breathing. Then she remembered being carried out to the car. She had no memory of being hit on the head and no memory of the car crashing. The next thing she would remember was waking up in the hospital. So she was asking for her mother when she woke up, but the nurses put her off and tried to keep her calm. And from their behavior, she was convinced that her mom had died. Natasha was terrified that her father would come back for her in the hospital, too. She was the only living witness, which put her in a lot of danger. Police were put outside her hospital room around the clock to keep her safe.
Well, that's a good idea. You don't want the only witness to have an accident.
No. And the police were able to get a search warrant for the Peernock house after they heard Natasha's full story. So once they were in the house, they found traces of blood. They found blood spatter on the walls. They found a whiskey bottle. And they found a tube with a mask, which is what he had used to force the alcohol down her throat. The metal from which the metal bar under the car had been cut was at the house, too. And they also found some cotton rope, like that had been under the vehicle. So, although he seems really clever, why would he leave all that behind?
I know. And he had to think that people would be in his house at some point.
Well, you would think, but maybe not. Maybe he just thought he was so smart they were going to think it was an accident and that would be the end of it. Which is possible. If the car had just hit the wall and exploded, there may not have been any more follow-up.
There might not have been, but it's still, to me, kind of stupid of him to leave all that stuff behind.
Yeah.
Where it could easily be found.
Well, you're right, sure. So what was interesting is that in their search, the police were surprised to find a huge amount of paperwork and notes left behind in Robert's handwriting. So they boxed up all the papers and took them as possible evidence. And later, they would find a lot of evidence of his plan, like to-do lists, checklists. So then investigators were surprised when the medical examiner did Claire's autopsy and concluded that she died in a traffic accident. The police tried to explain that Claire had been beaten to death and that her killer had tried to make it look like an accident, but the ME would not change his finding. He said her injuries were consistent with a traffic accident. So this is a huge problem because the police were working toward a murder charge against Robert Peernock. And if the cause of death was from a traffic accident, that's the end of their case.
There goes their case. That's right. Now, I'm not sure, from what I've read, it doesn't anywhere seem like her injuries were due to a traffic accident.
No,
So
I mean, especially if you looked at the car.
Yeah, how the ME decided that it was all accident trauma.
Yeah, I don't know. I think maybe just looked at the blunt force trauma, and maybe if you didn't see the vehicle and see the disparity there, you might think that came from a car accident. I don't know. It was just really kind of strange, and the police were a little bit shocked that he said that.
Yeah, I don't know that the ME did a good enough autopsy.
No, and the police didn't believe so. One of the detectives went to the head coroner and explained what was going on. If he had agreed that Claire had died in a traffic accident, the police investigation would be derailed. So the head coroner came down and looked at Claire's body, at the evidence, and at photos from the scene. And he determined it was a homicide and that Claire had died of blunt force trauma, not from a car accident. So now they have Natasha's statement, the autopsy report, and the evidence. So prosecutors were ready to pursue a murder charge against Robert. The police went back to his girlfriend Sonia, but she wasn't cooperating. She really was in love with Robert and trying to protect him. But investigators were able to get his bank statements and track him down, making large cash withdrawals from banks. They found out he had taken out over $50,000 just from one bank alone. So it definitely looked like he was getting ready to flee the country.
I wonder if he's going to take Sonia with him.
Well, she didn't seem to know. Police really believed that she was not involved, that she was just trying to protect him.
Because she was in love with him.
But if she believed all the conspiracy stuff and he said we need to leave the country, I bet she would have.
Yeah.
She was 100% in with him. So detectives went back to the Peernock house again to do more thorough processing of the scene. They used luminol on the floor, and in the living room there was a large body-sized reaction, indicating that there had been a body lying there bleeding. When the Los Angeles Times ran an article on the story, it caught the attention of Claire's divorce attorney, Victoria Doom. When she learned Claire had been killed, she called up detectives and told them that she thought she knew what the motive was. So apparently Claire had sent a letter to Victoria Doom saying if anything happened to her, then Robert was responsible. So we hear this time and time again. It's like your favorite thing when a victim says, if I end up dead, so-and-so did it.
I'd like to know the percentage of correct guesses that would be.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm sure people say it when it doesn't happen, but it seems to happen an awful lot to people who are killed.
Yeah, and they've said, if this happens, look at this person.
Yep, yep. But to me, that's kind of crazy, because if I really felt I was going to be murdered, the last thing on my mind is what they do after I'm murdered. I would want to prevent my murder at any cost.
Yeah.
But,
so you'd take steps to make sure it wasn't going to be you.
Right, but it seems like Claire got that $10,000 policy for her daughter as well, which I imagine would be shared between the two daughters. But anyway, she'd made an agreement with Robert to postpone the divorce for 6 months, and this was done under the pretense that he wanted to receive financing for a new business and that it would look better if they were still married.
Sure.
So they did have 3 income properties and over $250,000 in the bank. In 1987, this was a very substantial amount, over $700,000.
In today's money.
Yeah, $250 in that money, over $700 in today's money. Either way, it's a shit ton of money.
It's a good amount.
Yep. So in a divorce, Claire would get half, and he was not okay with that, of course. So now, within just a few days of the divorce going forward, Claire was dead, because he knew he had to kill her before August 1st, because that's when things would go through. So after Natasha was discharged from the hospital, detectives wanted to put her in a safe house, but she didn't really want to do that. She wanted to stay with a friend in Santa Clarita. So she went and stayed there for a few days, and with Robert still evading the police and Natasha both were quite worried that he would come back and try and kill her. A next-door neighbor soon contacted the police to tell them she was worried that a man was scoping out the house next door. So they went to talk to the neighbor. She said that she had a for sale sign in front of her house, and one day she was cleaning the house and a man walked right in. He walked right past her to the upstairs and looked out the window at the house next door. So she was quite worried. I think I would have been even more so. But she asked him what he was doing in her house, and he told her that he was a realtor. But then he left, so it was very sketchy. So she called the police, they came out, and when they showed her a photo of Robert Peernock, she identified him as that man that had been in her house. So pretty creepy, huh?
That's definitely creepy.
Yeah, I don't like it.
Now, do we know or do we assume that the police had some people watching Natasha while she was staying at a friend's house?
You would think, right? But the neighbor had to call them, so I'm not sure. But maybe they didn't see, him go in that house.
Yeah.
Good question. But the police still couldn't find Peernock, so they kept going back to his girlfriend Sonia. She was the only connection they had, so they put 24-hour surveillance on her. And they saw her making phone calls from different phone booths. So undercover officers would get as close as they could to her and listen to her conversations. They believed that she was talking to Peernock, that she believed his version of events, and that she just loved him. So they knew that she would do or say anything to help him, and she really didn't seem to believe that he really was involved.
So she was completely in with him.
Yep, very loyal. So about a month went by with investigators monitoring Sonia's calls, and finally they got a break to confirm she was talking to him. They heard her say, "I love you, Bob," before she hung up the phone. So they arrested her and brought her back to the police station. They told her the details of what he had done, and she really had a tough time accepting that that was true. To her, Bob Peernock was an innocent man who was being persecuted by a corrupt government. So she'd really bought into his whole story. The police decided that she probably was a decent person and she'd just been charmed and manipulated by him. But they weren't going to let it go at that. They charged her as an accessory after the fact for helping him get money and other things. And as they continued speaking with her, the DA was putting together the huge paper trail that Peernock had left behind. They explained how he had set up the car crash to murder his daughter. So before the crash, he killed Claire by crushing her skull with some kind of metal object. He then beat Natasha on the head. He poured gas over both of them, in the trunk and throughout the car's interior. He stuck Claire's foot on the gas with a leather shoelace, and he tied a lace around the gear shift. Then he stood outside the vehicle, and using the lace, he was able to pull it and cause the car to go forward. So this is elaborate.
Sure is.
But earlier when you were asking me if it was a garage, this is what it actually was.
It was to hold the gear shift.
Yep. So the plan was to send the car down the road until it hit a concrete wall and exploded, killing both his wife and his daughter. So, nice guy, huh?
Yeah, I guess so. He couldn't run alongside the car and steer it. He had to aim it.
Yeah.
And push it. And
well, yes.
It looks like the car left the road earlier than he had intended.
Yeah, so it didn't quite work out. So even after he put all that effort in, he didn't quite do it right. So still kind of a fuck up overall.
Yeah.
So a detective was finally able to get through to Sonia by telling her that she could save his life. So this was clever. The detective told her that if police spotted Robert, he would definitely be shot and killed. So if she turned him in, she could save his life. And she did eventually accept the logic of this. At least he'd be arrested and alive, and if he is innocent, he would have his chance to prove it in court. So by cooperating, Sonia was able to have her charges dropped as well. So she revealed his location to the detective. He was at the Vagabond Motel in Woodland Hills. The LAPD made their move to capture him, and one officer went to the door to kick it in, while one called the room's phone to distract him. So when Peernock was out and put on the ground and handcuffed, his ear was bleeding really badly and partially kind of torn. So, yeah, it turned out he'd gone to Las Vegas and had a facelift, and some of the stitches were torn out.
Now, I've seen pictures of him. I guess he did a good facelift, but he didn't look any different.
No, not at all. And if that was his idea, no, that did not work. So the surgery didn't change his appearance. He still looked like himself, but maybe with fewer wrinkles, and he did have a chin implant as well. But in his room, police found travel brochures to Australia, and he had over $20,000 in cash. Natasha was in Hawaii in hiding when she learned that he had been apprehended. So, of course, she was very relieved.
I imagine she was.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were relieved to have him finally caught. So he was charged with first-degree murder, and then he was transferred to a high-security jail. As he prepared for his trial, though, he stalled. The case went to trial in 1991 after Peernock underwent psychiatric exams to determine whether he was competent to stand trial. So he really did go through a few different lawyers, though, right? He wasn't an easy client.
No, I imagine with his personality that he probably went through more than one.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, he was horrible at the trial. He did finally hire attorney Don Green, and this was someone who was willing to defend him based on his whistleblower story. And in follow-up TV shows and articles about this case, Don Green still supported that Peernock was innocent. But still, in the middle of the trial, Peernock did attempt to fire Green, stating that he was working to rig a conviction. So, according to Peernock, no one was on his side.
He alone against all these opponents.
Yeah. And very bravely, Natasha was the prosecution's most important witness. As the trial went on, Peernock argued, yelled, and tried to go into all of his conspiracy theories. And at one point, he even threw a cassette tape at the jury, telling them to listen to it, and then they would understand everything and see that he was truly a victim. He refused to stop causing problems in the courtroom until he would finally be gagged, handcuffed, and forced to sit in a chair while the trial proceeded. And there are photos of him with, looks like duct tape around his face. It's amazing. That doesn't happen very often. So after he was convicted in the murder of his wife and the attempted murder of his daughter, Natasha, Peernock was also found guilty of trying to hire a fellow inmate to kill both Natasha and her attorney, Victoria Doom. So this really did change Victoria's life, because can you imagine having someone trying to hire someone in prison to kill you?
Yeah, that's kind of a bummer, isn't it?
Really is scary. It seems like these criminals who are in prison or jail, and then they think they can hire someone to go out and kill witnesses or lawyers or prosecutors even, or lead detectives. It's craziness.
Yeah, but a lot of these stories are just inmates trying to get a reduction in their sentence.
Well, yes, when the other inmate is just telling the story.
Yeah.
Yeah, but these were actually confirmed. And it's not surprising, because he'd already been looking for Natasha to kill.
Yeah.
So the judge sentenced him to 2 life terms plus 22 years and 4 months. And the significance of that was that Natasha, his daughter, was 22 years old and 4 months at the time of the sentencing. So it was kind of in her honor, because imagine, that's her own father. It's just really horrible. Not to mention her mom being killed right there with her. So she went through a hell of a lot and really had a tough time throughout her whole life. So Robert died in prison after getting COVID-19, and he was 85 years old. So he lived a pretty long life in prison.
Yes, he did. Around 40 years or so.
Yeah. And I bet he wasn't the greatest prisoner. But he was kind of smart and had some talents, so he probably got along fine. If you have to have something to offer in prison, or you're pretty much screwed, I think.
Yeah, there's got to be something you can do.
Yeah, you've got to be able to help with their lawyering, or fixing things a certain way, or having money. You have to have something. So I guess he got along okay in there. But his daughter was very relieved when she heard he died.
Yeah.
Yeah. So quite a case, huh?
Yeah, it's amazing. A lot of these cases we do sound like you're just telling a story.
Yes. Well, yeah, because they're so far-fetched, but true.
Yep.
Yep.
Continue to amaze me. What people can do to other people.
Absolutely. So we're going to move on to feedback, but before we do, I'd just like to say, if you're a fan of True Crime Brewery and you just can't get enough of our storytelling and our thoughtful analysis, subscribing at tiegrabber.com/subscribe is the perfect next step. As a subscriber, you'll enjoy every episode completely ad-free, so you'll stay immersed in the chilling details without any interruptions. Plus, you'll get access to exclusive bonus episodes that dive into the most fascinating and disturbing cases. And this is content you won't hear anywhere else. Your support not only helps keep the beer and the stories flowing here, but it also allows us to continue delivering the content that you love. So whether you're in it for the psychology, the mystery, or even the craft beer pairings, subscribing is a wonderful way to show your appreciation and to get even more of what makes True Crime Brewery so addictive. So if this sounds good to you, just head on over to tiegrabber.com/subscribe and join the Tie Grabber community today. We certainly would appreciate it.
Jill, you ready to do some feedback?
I am. I would love to do some feedback. And I'm going to start us out with a voicemail from friend of the show, Nate, because he has 2 or 3 things that I thought were interesting. So let's hear it.
Hi, Dick and Jill. It's Nate. I hope you guys are doing well. I actually have a couple of cases related to car accidents. Well, it's kind of like fatal. Some are driving while intoxicated. The first up is Rebecca Grossman, whose trial was adjudicated last year. She was drinking and driving, and she had Valium in her system when she ran down 2 boys in San Diego while racing with her boyfriend, who is a former Major League Baseball player. The other one is Bradford Castler, who killed 2 people at Sweet Tomatoes in Newton, Massachusetts, which happens to be one of my favorite restaurants growing up in Brookline, Mass. But he had, I guess, multiple sclerosis, and he was kind of told that he shouldn't be driving, but the doctor didn't say, you're not supposed to be driving. It was kind of like, and he made that decision on his own. But I guess he got a 5 or 6 year sentence in prison. I think he was just released from prison, actually, not too long ago. But it's like, at what point do you say to yourself, if you have major disability that affects your ability to drive, is it up to you to decide that, or should it be up to the state to decide that? And the last case is Darian Hess, who killed 2 cyclists while driving impaired in New Hampshire. And she, I think, got a 15 to 20 year sentence. Plus, there was a case of a mother and daughter down in Atlanta where the mother covered up for the daughter when the daughter, I'm blanking on the name, but the daughter caused a crash where 6 people died. And then the mom tried to cover it up by having the car fixed in private. And so the daughter got, I think, a life sentence for the car accident, and then the mom got like a 10-year sentence for covering it up. It was a pretty crazy case. No one's ever covered that one. But I mean, it's crazy to think that if your child is guilty of something like that, that you would try to cover it up for them rather than having them take responsibility for their action. Anyway, hope you guys are doing well, and stay cool this summer. The Southwest is very hot. Anyway, take care. Bye.
Well, thank you, Nate. So yeah, first of all, parental cover-up. What do you think about that?
Well, parents are supposed to provide examples to their children of how to live a good life. And kid gets into trouble, you try to look out for them, help them in any way you can. But this is not the way to do it.
Yeah, I think the problem might be that the kids that do this kind of thing are often kids who weren't raised right and have parents who would try and help them get away with it. If you think about Paul Murdoch, that case with the boat crash, he'd had several car crashes beforehand that had been covered up by his family, and they certainly were anxious to try and cover up the boat crash too. And there are many other examples of that sort of thing.
Yeah, so your theory or your idea is that kids who do some horrible thing and they don't get punished for it because the parents take steps to keep it hidden, that there's something wrong in a sense with the parents.
Of course, yeah, I think so.
They didn't get their values where they lost them somewhere.
Yeah, I'm not saying that any misbehaving child has shitty parents. That's not true. But I am saying that someone who does this kind of thing is more likely to have parents who are immoral or don't care so much about following the law, or in many instances feel entitled. So what about disability? Who decides when you're disabled if you shouldn't be driving? That's a difficult question. Can doctors make that decision? Or does it need to be through the state? Or are we just going to rely on the individual?
Well, you can't just rely on the individual because they want to, most of the time they want to keep driving.
Right, so it's hard for them to be objective, even if they think they are being, which is similar to elderly people when they can't drive anymore. It brings to mind your mother who drove into her 90s and seemed fine driving to the grocery store and back, but as she got older, she could start to cause a danger on the highway, like one time turning the wrong way onto the highway.
Yeah, she did that.
And this was a woman who was very sharp, but even if you are mentally sharp, your reflexes, things like that, they do slow down.
Well, they definitely do.
Yeah.
In my mother's case, and she ended up just driving from her home to the grocery store, which was about 2 miles away.
Right.
And she could do that pretty well. Although, if you looked at her garage door, it had all sorts of wounds to it.
Right,
from
right.
her pulling back in.
Yeah.
So
but that wasn't hurting anyone else. That was just banging up her car in her garage.
Yeah. But I was just wondering how many cars she dinged up in the Hannaford parking lot.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think she was probably more careful in the parking lot. I think she actually didn't try to park real close to other cars.
Now, but getting back to Mr. Castler, we don't know that he considered not driving.
Yeah, well, we don't really know the background of it, but when did it happen? It happened in 2016. So Castler drove his car into a pizza shop, killing 2 and injuring 7. and his attorneys blamed the accident on his multiple sclerosis. So the attorneys even blamed it on that, so that's not great in his favor, really. He was convicted on 2 charges of motor vehicle homicide and 1 charge of driving to endanger, and he received a sentence of just 4 years, so pretty light sentence considering he killed 2 people and injured 7 others.
Yeah, because the other 2 examples that Nate gave us, those people got much stiffer sentences.
Well, those people were impaired by alcohol or drugs. Rebecca Grossman, a philanthropist and socialite in Los Angeles, who struck and killed 2 young boys while they were crossing the street in a crosswalk. She and her then boyfriend, Scott Erickson, had been drinking before the accident. And although she was under the legal limit for driving, she still got convicted. Now, she said that her boyfriend in the other car hit the boys first, but apparently that was not believed. The accident happened in 2020, and she just had her trial last year, and she was found guilty of 2 counts each of second-degree murder, vehicular homicide, and 1 count of hit-and-run driving. And she was sentenced to 15 years to life. So she currently resides at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla.
Yeah, well, I think she got convicted because she was probably racing her boyfriend.
Right. Yep.
I'm not 100% sure, but they had been drinking before they left, and they were each driving their own car. And there was some question about maybe they were racing a little bit.
Well, so if nothing else, it was reckless driving.
And the kids were crossing where they should have in a crosswalk.
Right. And it was a hit and run. That's a big part.
Hit and run. That's a big one.
That's a really big one if you don't stop. So the third one, Darian Hess, she drove into a group of cyclists in September 2013 and killed 2 of them. She was unlicensed and under the influence of painkillers when she struck the cyclists. So she was found to have fentanyl, Klonopin, and Percocet in her system, and 8 hours before the accident, she had received a ticket for speeding. I don't know how significant that is because we don't know if she was on the drugs at that time. But she pleaded guilty to 2 counts each of manslaughter and second-degree assault, and she was sentenced to 15 to 40 years in prison, so a significantly longer sentence.
Yeah, well, this woman was impaired. I guess that's one reason to go a little more forcefully with her sentencing.
Yeah, I suppose so. Well, it's interesting because the disabled man was impaired, but he wasn't really at fault for being impaired because he didn't take a drug. But if you look at drug abuse and alcoholism as a disease, then you could say it was a disability that she had.
Yes.
So, of course, you have to give her more of a punishment, I believe, because otherwise it would be repeated, because people who drink and drive or do drugs and drive are known to be repeat offenders. And the only way you stop them is sometimes taking their license away, but sometimes not. Like she'd already lost her license, but was still driving. So sometimes they do need to be locked up.
Well, and she is.
Yeah, she is.
Up.
That's right. Okay, I had a couple of updates I wanted to talk about, and the first one is Crystal Rogers. So Crystal Rogers went missing back in July of 2015 from the home she shared with her boyfriend and their 2-year-old son. So Crystal and her boyfriend, Brooks Houck, had a really difficult relationship, kind of off and on and volatile. And according to Brooks, Crystal would sometimes leave for a day or 2 just to decompress. Crystal's family was convinced that Brooks was responsible for her disappearance, and most people who heard about it were convinced. After several years of investigation, Brooks was charged in Crystal's murder in 2023. Joseph Lawson and his father, Steve Lawson, were charged as accomplices. So in the trial, Brooks was found guilty of murder and tampering with evidence. Joseph Lawson was found guilty of tampering with evidence. Steve Lawson had already been found guilty of evidence tampering in an earlier trial, and Crystal's body has never been found. So the jury recommended a sentence of life for Brooks and 20 years for conspiracy. Formal sentencing is scheduled for August 21st. So I think one of the most interesting things about this trial for me was Brooke's story of what happened the night Crystal went missing. So Crystal had told her friends and family that she was having a romantic night out with Brooks that night. She was excited about it. Crystal had 5 children, including her 2.5-year-old that she had with Brooks, and she had babysitting arranged for all of them. But then Brooks would say their night out was them walking around the farm with the 2.5-year-old that whole evening in the rain and until like midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. So that didn't seem believable. Then he also said that she was on her phone playing games until really late in the night while the little kid was running around. And she was playing these games on her cell phone. But the hole in that story is that her phone had been turned off and never turned on again hours earlier. He'd also gotten some dark tinting on his car windows, and the prosecution believed he did that to prevent people from seeing whether she was in the car with him or not. And another case to update would be Corey Richens. So she's a real estate agent and ended up being a children's book author of 1 book. And she's accused of murdering her husband, Eric Richens, by poisoning him with a fentanyl-laced Moscow Mule in March of 2022. After his death, she published a grief book titled Are You With Me? And this was aimed at helping children cope with loss. So she even ended up going on morning talk shows to talk about this book and had a little bit of fame from it. Prosecutors alleged the murder was financially motivated and was tied to some fraudulent financial activities. So the couple was married in 2013, and in 2021, it's believed that Corey began stealing from Eric's accounts and forging documents. In February of 2022, Eric became ill after eating a sandwich from Corey, and he suspected that she poisoned him. So that's a bad sign that he would think that.
Yeah, but why did he drink the Moscow Mule? If he suspects his wife of trying to poison him,
yeah,
why would he even touch anything prepared by her?
I don't know. It was like a month later when he consumed the Moscow Mule and died. And she published the book about a year after that. Then about 2-3 months after the book was published, she was arrested and charged with murder and drug possession. So investigations would reveal financial fraud and misuse of power of attorney. Then, just this June 2025, 26 new charges were filed, including mortgage fraud, money laundering, forgery, and more. So currently, Corey has pleaded not guilty to all charges. She remains in custody awaiting trial, and the case has expanded to include a complex web of financial crime. So a court hearing is expected to address the subpoena dispute and set a trial date. And we don't know yet if this trial will be televised, but it would be a good one to watch if it is. One thing I remember about this case, which we saw, was it on a Dateline? I think it was Dateline, was how he was laying in the house dying for hours. She never called 911. She called some friends. She took a picture of him lying in the kitchen, on the kitchen floor, I think. Also, when they checked her Google searches, she had searched things about fentanyl and even things about prison. And one interesting thing she searched for was how to get someone to write a book for you. So we don't even know if she really wrote that book herself.
Might not.
So just a complete fraud. They had a business where they were doing contracts for, I believe it was for weapons, for guns. And she said they had all these contracts. They got friends and family to invest. And apparently Eric thought that it was going well. But she was doing pretty much a Ponzi scheme, right?
She was cooking the books, we know that.
Yeah, but taking money from people to invest and paying them off a little with new investors' money,
right,
which is a Ponzi scheme, and it never lasts for that long. It has to end at some point.
That it does.
So that'll be a fascinating one to see.
Yeah, I'd like to watch that trial.
Yes, absolutely. All right, well, thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll see you next time at The Quiet End.
Plenty of seats. Come on down.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.